Welcome to your own personal deep dive. And today we are going to be tackling a concept that I think a lot of people just kind of take for granted. It seems simple on the surface, but we're going to find out as we get into it that it is anything but simple. The idea of boundaries.
hmm
And you as a philosopher, I think, really understand how deceptively complex this can be.
Oh, absolutely. The concept of a boundary has kept philosophers busy for centuries. It really forces us to kind of confront some really fundamental questions about how we understand reality, what it means to separate one thing from another.
Exactly. And our guide for today's deep dive is going to be the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on boundary.
Huh.
We're going to unpack some truly head-scratching questions like, do boundaries even actually exist, or are they just convenient fictions we make up?
Yeah, and how can something with no physical thickness, like a line, actually divide two things? It's a very strange idea when you start to think about it.
Okay, so let's start with the basics when we talk about boundaries. How do philosophers even define this thing we call a boundary?
Well, we can go all the way back to the classic Euclidean Aristotelian definition of a boundary is that which is an extremity of anything.
Sounds simple enough, but I'm sensing there's more to it than that.
There is, yeah. Aristotle kind of elaborated on this by saying a boundary is the last point of one thing and the first point beyond which you can't find any part of that thing. So it's the ultimate edge, the ultimate limit.
So if we're thinking about like a physical object like an apple, the boundary would be the skin, the outermost layer.
Hmm.
But, it seems like this definition could also apply to abstract concepts like the limits of free speech or the beginning and end of an era.
Exactly. It acts as a demarcation whether we're talking about physical objects or ideas, and this is where the fun begins.
Fun or maybe frustration, because I'm already sensing a paradox brewing here. If a boundary separates two things, who owns the boundary? Does it belong to one, both, or neither?
Ah, yes. The classic problem of boundary ownership, and we can see this in the real world. Like, let's take, for example, the Mason-Dixon line that historically separated Maryland and Pennsylvania. Does that line belong to one state or both or neither?
It seems like it would have to belong to one or the other, but how can you pinpoint exactly where one state ends and the other begins?
Exactly. And this is where the concept of a continuum kind of trips us up because on a continuum, there's always another point between any 2 points. So if
Mhm.
you try to find the last point in Maryland and the first point in Pennsylvania, you end up in kind of an infinite regress.
It's like trying to find the smallest possible piece of something. You could keep dividing it forever.
And this isn't just limited to like geography. Leonardo da Vinci famously pondered this question about the division of air and water.
Yeah.
What is that dividing line? Is it air or is it water?
It's like those optical illusions where you can't tell which shape is in front and which is behind.
Exactly. It really exposes the challenges of reconciling our intuitive understanding of boundaries with the kind of complexities of reality, especially when you start dealing with continuum.
It's like the closer we look, the more blurry the lines become.
Precisely. And this brings us to another kind of tricky distinction, which is natural versus artificial boundaries.
At first glance, it seems pretty simple. The coastline of Britain feels natural. The border between two countries on a map feels artificial. But I'm guessing it's not that straightforward.
You're right to be suspicious because take that coastline again. Its length actually depends on how we measure it. The more closely you look, the more intricate the coastline becomes, potentially stretching its length infinitely.
So the continuum problem strikes again.
It highlights that even seemingly natural boundaries are subject to human interpretation and measurement. So this raises a question, is a human-made boundary, like a border between two countries, any less real than a natural one?
That's a great question. If the boundary is made up, does that make the object itself less real? It
Yeah.
really makes you question the nature of reality itself.
Exactly. Some philosophers argue that most, if not all, boundaries are fundamentally what we call fiat, meaning that they're based on human conventions rather than kind of inherent divisions in the world.
So if a lot of boundaries are essentially made up,
Yeah.
how do we deal with the fuzzy ones? The ones that don't have these clear-cut edges? Like, when does someone go from not bald to bald?
Ah, yes, the classic problem of vagueness, a philosophical headache for the ages.
It reminds me of the Soderates paradox. How many grains of sand make a heap, remove one, and it's still a heap. Keep going.
Yeah.
Eventually it's not. But where's the exact point of transition? It's mind-boggling.
Yeah, the philosophical debate revolves around whether the fuzziness is inherent in the world itself, what we call derive vagueness, or whether it's just a limitation of our language and how we describe things, didicto vagueness.
So in the case of baldness, is the fuzziness in the actual hair distribution or just in how we define the word bald?
Precisely. And the Sorites paradox really illustrates the difficulty of crossing a fuzzy boundary when no single step makes a difference.
It's like being stuck in philosophical limbo. never fully in one category or the other.
Exactly. These paradoxes force us to question not just the nature of boundaries themselves, but the very way we think and categorize the world around us.
This is getting deep, and we haven't even touched on the question of whether boundaries are actually real or just convenient abstractions.
Don't worry, we're getting there. But first, I think it's worth spending a little more time unpacking this idea of vagueness and its implications for our understanding of boundaries. What do you think? This vagueness that we've been talking about, uh, it isn't just a philosophical curiosity. It actually has like real world implications, especially when we start thinking about, boundaries in law or ethics or even in our personal relationships.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Laws often rely on like clear-cut categories and definitions, but what happens when those categories become blurry?
Exactly. Think about something like the legal definition of adulthood, right? We set an arbitrary age, say 18, but
Hmm.
is there a precise moment when someone transitions from childhood to adulthood, or is it more of a gradual process?
It's like that saying, growing old is mandatory, growing up is optional. Legally, we might be adults, but, do we ever really stop evolving and changing?
Precisely. And this fuzziness can lead to all sorts of like legal and ethical dilemmas. What rights and responsibilities should be granted to someone who falls within this vague boundary zone? How do we make like fair and consistent judgments when the lines aren't clear?
And it's not just in legal systems either, right? Think about personal relationships. When does a friendship become a romantic relationship, or when does a disagreement become a deal breaker?
Excellent point. Navigating these fuzzy boundaries in our personal lives requires constant communication and negotiation because what one person considers a minor issue might be a huge red flag for someone else.
And without clear boundaries, it's easy to end up in misunderstandings and hurt feelings. So it seems like this concept of vagueness kind of challenges this very notion of objectivity. If boundaries can be fuzzy, does that mean that truth itself is subjective?
That's a really deep question, and one that philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries. Some argue that vagueness is just a fundamental feature of reality, while others believe it's a limitation of our language or our perception.
So are we stuck in a world where like nothing is truly definite, where everything's open to interpretation?
Not
Yeah.
necessarily. While vagueness might make things kind of messier and more complex, it doesn't completely undermine the possibility of knowledge or objective truth. It just means we need to be more nuanced and careful in our thinking.
Just like we need to develop a higher tolerance for ambiguity.
Precisely recognizing the inherent fuzziness of many boundaries doesn't mean abandoning all attempts at categorization or judgment. It just means being aware of the limitations and potential pitfalls.
So we need to be comfortable with the gray areas while still striving for clarity and understanding it's a delicate balancing act.
Exactly. And this brings us back to this fundamental question that we touched on earlier. Do boundaries actually exist as like independent entities in the world, or are they just convenient abstractions that we create to make sense of things?
The realist versus non-realist showdown. I'm ready for round two.
Okay.
So let's start with the realist. What do they have to say about the existence of boundaries?
Well, realists believe that boundaries have some kind of objective existence, even if they're not always like easily defined or perceived.
Mhm.
They take the paradoxes that we've been discussing seriously and try to develop theories that can account for them.
So they're not just dismissing them as word games. They're actually trying to find solutions within the framework of a world where boundaries are a real thing.
Exactly. But even among realists, there's no one agreed upon view of how boundaries relate to the objects they supposedly bound.
Okay, so let's break down the realist camp. What are some of the main theories that they've proposed?
Well, imagine you have two objects, A and B, and they're separated by a shared boundary. The first realist view, and maybe the most radical, is that the boundary belongs to neither object. It's kind of like a no man's land separating the two.
So in our Mason-Dixon line example, this would mean that the line itself isn't part of Maryland or Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
It exists independently.
Precisely. This view allows both objects to remain open, meaning they don't include their boundaries.
Mhm.
So it's like having a buffer zone that prevents any awkward overlap or the paradox of direct contact.
I can see how that neatly sidesteps some of the thorny issues, but doesn't it raise other problems if the boundary doesn't belong to either object? How can it truly separate them? It's like a referee who's not part of the game but still gets to make the calls.
That's a valid point, and that's precisely why this view isn't all that popular. It leaves the boundary in a kind of ontological limbo with a very precarious existence.
Ontologically homeless, you might say. All right, so into camp number two, what's their take on this boundary ownership issue?
The second view suggests that the boundary belongs to either A or B, but it's indeterminate which one.
So the Mason-Dixon line could belong to either Maryland or Pennsylvania, but we just can't say for sure which one. It's like a philosophical coin toss.
You could say that this view kind of leans on the concept of a continuum, since you can't pinpoint a definite last point of one object and a first point of the other. The ownership of the boundary remains ambiguous.
Makes sense given the infinite divisibility we talked about earlier, but is this indeterminacy a real feature of the world or just a reflection of our limited language and concepts?
That's a great question, and the answer probably depends on the specific boundary that we're talking about. A human-drawn boundary like a property line might be indeterminate simply because of our imprecise definitions, but a natural boundary like the edge of a cloud, might have a deeper ontological fuzziness.
So in some cases, the vagueness might be in the world itself, while in other cases it might just be in our heads.
Exactly. Now, the third realist view gets even more daring. They argue that the boundary can actually belong to both objects simultaneously.
Wait, how is that possible?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that violate some pretty fundamental logical principles?
It does seem to contradict the principle of non-contradiction, the idea that something can't be both A and not A at the same time, but proponents of this view argue that the overlap is of a special, lower dimensional kind.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Explain this lower dimensional overlap.
So remember how we talked about boundaries not taking up space in the same way that ordinary objects do? They're considered lower dimensional entities, so in principle, they could overlap without actually occupying the same physical space.
So it's like two ghosts occupying the same room. Spooky, but not physically impossible.
That's a great analogy, but even this view has its critics. It requires a rather flexible interpretation of logic and ontology.
Sounds like we're getting into some pretty mind-bending territory here.
We are, but that's what makes the philosophy of boundary so fascinating. Now, the fourth, and perhaps the most intuitive realist view, is that there are actually two boundaries, one for each object, and they just happen to coincide spatially.
So it's like double the boundaries. Maryland gets its own Mason-Dixon line.
Yeah.
Pennsylvania gets its own. They just happen to be in the same place.
Precisely. It's like two sheets of paper perfectly stacked on top of each other. They each have their own surface, but those surfaces coincide without merging.
So this seems like a way to avoid those logical contradictions we were talking about earlier.
Okay.
Each state gets its own distinct boundary.
Exactly. This view allows us to preserve the distinctness of the objects while still accounting for their apparent contact.
But wouldn't this mean that like two things are occupying the same space?
It does seem to challenge our intuitive understanding of physical space. But remember, boundaries are considered lower dimensional entities. They don't have volume in the same way that ordinary objects do.
So they could theoretically coincide spatially without bumping into each other like two intersecting lines.
That's the idea, but even this view has its challenges. It raises questions about the nature of space and the relationship between these lower dimensional entities and the three-dimensional world that we experience.
Okay, so we've explored 4 different flavors of realism, each trying to grapple with these paradoxes of boundary ownership and existence. It seems like a lot of mental gymnastics just to explain something that feels intuitively simple. What about the non-realists? Do they offer a simpler solution?
Well, as you might expect, non-realists take a completely different approach. They're not convinced by any of these realist attempts to reconcile boundaries with the complexities of reality. They see boundaries as abstractions, mental constructs that we use to organize our experience, but not as entities that exist independently in the world. What do you think about that perspective?
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective.
Yeah.
I can see how boundaries could be seen as just kind of like mental tools
Yeah.
that we use to simplify a very complex world. But doesn't that make the things they define somehow less real?
That's a common objection, to these non-realist views. But
Yep.
but think about it this way, like we draw lines of latitude and longitude on maps to help us navigate right, but those lines don't physically exist on the Earth. Does that make the Earth any less real?
That's a good point. It seems like we're talking about different levels of reality here. Like the Earth is physically real, whereas the lines on the map are conceptually real, but, they serve a purpose.
Exactly. So non-realists might argue that boundaries are kind of like those lines on a map. They're useful fictions that help us organize our perceptions and make sense of the world, but, we shouldn't mistake them for something more than that.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how this works, but what about seemingly natural boundaries like coastlines or mountain ranges? Are those just abstractions too?
Yeah, that's where things get a bit trickier even among non-realists. There are different approaches. Some might say that while objects themselves don't have inherent boundaries, their location in space-time does.
So the space an object occupies has boundaries, even if the object itself doesn't.
Precisely, think of like a cup sitting on a table, right? The cup itself might not have a perfectly defined boundary, but the region of space-time that it occupies does have like clear limits.
Okay, so we're shifting the boundary problem from the object to the space it inhabits. That's clever. But what about those who, you know, reject the very idea of space-time as like a fundamental entity?
Now you're delving into some truly radical territory because for those who view space-time itself as an abstraction derived from relationships between objects, the concept of a boundary becomes even more ephemeral.
So it's like boundaries are abstractions built upon extractions.
You got it. And one prominent non-realist approach in this camp is the theory of extensive abstraction, which was championed by Alfred North Whitehead. And this theory proposes that we construct the concept of a boundary by considering increasingly smaller parts of an object, but with no final indivisible core.
It's like those Russian nesting dolls, but with no tiny doll at the very center.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the boundary then becomes a kind of limit or vanishing point in this infinite series of nested objects rather than a concrete entity.
It's a very elegant solution, I have to admit, but it does make my head spin a little.
Well, as with all philosophical theories, there are challenges, right? Some argue that this abstract notion of boundaries can't fully account for all of our experiences. We can see and touch the surface of a table, but can we really perceive an infinite series of nested table parts?
It's like we're so focused on the theoretical framework that we kind of lose sight of the actual table in front of us.
Exactly. Critics argue that non-realist theories might be formally sound, but they lack the kind of explanatory power to fully capture our intuitions about boundaries.
So it's a clash between the neatness of the theory and the messiness of lived experience. It seems like this whole debate about the nature of boundaries ultimately boils down to like this fundamental question about the nature of reality itself.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's about whether we believe in a world, with inherent divisions and categories, or whether those divisions are primarily imposed by our minds.
And this debate has implications that reach far beyond metaphysics. The way we understand boundaries shapes our views on everything from politics and law to ethics and personal relationships.
Absolutely. Think about how the concept of boundaries plays out in geopolitics, for example. National borders are often seen as like these lines in the sand separating one people from another. But as we've seen, the reality is far more complex and nuanced.
Right. Those lines on a map.
Mhm.
They often represent centuries of history and culture and conflict.
Yeah,
They can be sources of division and tension, but also of cooperation and exchange.
precisely. And the way we think about those boundaries, whether as fixed and absolute or as fluid and negotiable, has a huge impact on how we approach issues like immigration or trade or international relations.
Well, this deep dive has really opened my eyes to the multifaceted nature of boundaries. They're not just these physical lines or abstract concepts. They're woven into the very fabric of our reality, shaping how we perceive the world and how we interact with each other.
And as we've seen, there's no easy answer to the question of what boundaries really are. It's a philosophical puzzle that has kept thinkers busy for centuries and will likely continue to do so for many more to come.
Well, a huge thanks to you, dear listener, for joining us on this philosophical journey. It's been a fascinating exploration of a concept that, despite its seeming simplicity, really opens up this whole world of complexity and wonder.
Indeed. And as you continue to ponder the nature of boundaries, just remember that the journey is often more important than the destination. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep pushing the boundaries of your own understanding.
Well said. And with that, we'll bring this deep dive to a close. But the conversation doesn't have to end here. What are your thoughts on the nature of boundaries? What insights have resonated with you most? We encourage you to continue exploring this fascinating topic and share your own perspectives with the world. Until next time, keep diving deep.